Rebecca received her PhD from Emory in 2004. She's a historian of West Africa, and she's the author of a really fantastic book called The Fante and the Transatlantic Trade, which was a finalist for the 2012 Herskovits Prize, which is now the best book award, I think, from the African Studies Association. And she's also the author of an edited volume with Trevor Get on slavery and its legacy in Ghana and the diaspora, as well as a number of articles and book chapters that I'm not going to go through right now. But I'm super excited to hear her talk, which is on a new project on the West African roots of Pan-Africanism, a book-length project. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Neil. Thank you to the program for inviting me and giving me 2.5 years to get ready to come. It's a pleasure to be here and tell you a little bit about my current book project. The project is about Fante history. The Fante are a population that lives in the coastal part, the central coastal part of Ghana. And first, I have to kind of give you a sense of what the project is about. It's trying to kind of bridge what I feel like is a gap between two phases in the history of Ghana. So my first book and dissertation was about the 18th century. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fante in the 18th century and the kinds of things that are important about the Fante's history during the 18th century. And then I'm going to jump to the 1860s and talk about this fairly well-known, if you can say there's something in Fante history that's well-known, fairly well-known episode in Fante history called the Fante Confederacy in 1868 and what that was about. And then I'll back up and talk about what my project is aiming to do in order to make sense of how the 18th century Fante became the Fantes who created the Fante Confederacy in 1868. Like, how do we get from the era of the slave trade to this really amazing early African nationalist movement in less than 7 decades, basically. Can you hear me okay? Do I need to be closer to the mic? It's okay. All right. All right, so you are a well-informed bunch. You probably already know where Ghana is, but I don't ever make assumptions. So Ghana, of course, was referred to by Europeans from the 15th century up until the end of the colonial period as the Gold Coast. I will refer to Ghana and the Gold Coast sort of interchangeably. It's really Ghana, but sometimes it makes more sense to say Gold Coast. But if I say Ghana, Ghana in the 18th century, I'm still talking about this Ghana and not the one up here, right? Because that's the real pre-colonial Ghana. All right, so the book is about the coastal population of southern Ghana, then the Gold Coast, and the ways their history was intertwined with the history of the transatlantic slave trade. I really, this is for the 18th century project, wanted to tell a story about the Fante, primarily because when I was at the University of Ghana for a year abroad, I worked with a professor named John Finn, who's kind of the ultimate Fante historian, and he got me interested in Fante history. But as I started to research the history of the Fante, it turned out that it was hard to avoid the slave trade, right? I didn't really want to study or write about slavery or the slave trade, and I think we could talk about that, actually, like, what's the significance of focusing on slavery and the slave trade in African history? what are the reasons to avoid focusing on slavery and the slave trade in African history? But in any case, I ended up writing this book that was about the Fante and the slave trade. And in fact, an estimated 1.2 million captive people were taken on slave ships from Ghana, and almost all of them were taken during the 1700s, mainly on British and North American ships. So, of course, this massive trade in captured people profoundly affected the local history. And particularly the people who now identify themselves as the Fante, because the three main slave trading markets were within their territory. These three little circles, Elmina, Cape Coast, Anamabo, and this is sort of loosely Fante territory. So the first book sought to explain how Fante history was intertwined with the history of the transatlantic slave trade. I analyzed the evolution of political and cultural institutions during the 18th century and showed how the Fante elites, and this is important to emphasize because not everyone in Africa was involved in the slave trade, right? Just like not everyone in any other part of the Atlantic world was involved. It's really something that elites did, and everybody else suffered the consequences. How did they use their commercial, diplomatic, and personal relationships with transatlantic traders, mainly British, to build a coalition-style government that could defend the region against the constant military pressure from the northern kingdom of Asante? And also to coordinate a set of regulations for the coastal trade to protect their middleman role in the sale of captives to slave ships. So the book traced, a variety of images here. The book traced the development of community-based militia groups known as Asafo companies. It examined their importance in providing local defense, as well as mobile units to support larger military campaigns against Asante. Another chapter examined the role of a shrine that emerged as the spiritual center of the Fante region. The sacred grove, known as Nananampo, was consulted by the rulers of the coalition before going to war or making other important decisions regarding peace and diplomacy in the region. It was also the essence of Fante identity that was growing among the coastal population. And this grove is the burial place of the first Fante ancestors who migrated southward to the coast, and they're buried here, and it's also the site of a powerful god. So it's both a historical marker and a sacred place for Fante history. So I ultimately argued that what we now recognize as Fante ethnic identity congealed during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, that is the 18th century, among a diverse coastal African population. It was, to a large extent, a result of their political unification, participation in shared militia institutions, and multi-generational experience of occupying a physical and psychological space in between the Atlantic port towns on the coast and the Asante Kingdom to the north, both of which, in different ways, threatened their sovereignty. The spread of the Fante language, group identity, and culture was an example of ethnogenesis as well as state formation in the 18th century. So there's the book, yay. All right, so since finishing that project, I've been compelled to wonder what happened next. The slave trade ended, thank God, quite abruptly on the Ghana coast compared to areas further east like Nigeria and Angola. By the 1810s, the Fante territory had relatively little slave trading, although much of it had shifted eastward to the coastal area east of Accra. So now I'm going to jump to the 1860s and talk about the event that ends my current inquiry. When you start investigating the 19th century history of this region, relatively little is said about Fante state formation. But there's one major exception. In Ghana especially, the Fante are known as the initiators of one of sub-Saharan Africa's first modern nationalist movements. Not Kwame Nkrumah, but the Fante Confederacy. In 1868, a group of Fante traditional rulers and merchant elites gathered in the town of Monkessim, not far from the shrine that we were just looking at. And they gathered to formulate a response to an acute political and military crisis facing the region. The coast was under attack by Ashanti, as it had been many times during the previous century. But this time, the British administrator in Cape Coast Castle refused to offer any help to the Fante, breaking with a long precedent of Anglo-Fante cooperation. The Fante elites gathered at Monkessim literally created a new government to deal with the situation, which constituted nothing less than an act of modern African state formation. Their Fante Confederacy, or Confederation, those two words get used interchangeably, it was to be a new governing body that united the coastal region politically and militarily into what its leaders dubbed the Fante Nation. They sent written notice of their actions to the British administrator and proceeded to draw up a formal written constitution over the next couple of years. So these are some early photographs that have been reproduced so many times, they look like this. And also, I don't think anybody knows where they originally came from. But these are two of the several individuals who were involved in the creation of the Fante Confederacy and writing its constitution, just to give you some sense of what they might have looked like. The Constitution created distinct branches of government and appointed a president and other office holders. And here's just a bit of the language of the written constitution of the Fante Confederacy. I won't read it because that's annoying. Just give you a second. Is it readable? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So, as a sovereign nation, the Fante Confederation was short-lived. Most of the British officials working on the Gold Coast at that time, the 1868, 1869, 1870, 71, and ultimately the officials in the colonial office in London resented what they perceived as a treasonous act by Africans, right? Because they imagined that they controlled the Gold Coast, even though there was no legal basis for that claim. So they perceived it as treason by Africans who had overstepped their bounds. In the 1860s, of course, Britons and most white people generally around the globe expected Africans to behave as the so-called less civilized society that they believed them to be. So the leaders of the Confederacy were arrested and imprisoned by British soldiers, even though Britain had no legal authority to take such action. In 1873, Asante armies invaded the coast as they had promised to do. This time, the British managed to successfully defend their forts and proceeded all the way to the Asante capital at Kumasi, which they sacked. The next year, 1874, Britain declared colonial rule over the Gold Coast. So the announcement, the creation of the Fante Confederacy was sort of the last gasp of Fante political autonomy and effort to pave their own way forward as a nation before Britain finally made up its mind whether to stay or to go, and primarily because of Asante declared colonial rule over the coastal territory, which of course was the Fante territory. In spite of the brevity of the Fante Confederation, it only lasted a few years, and in spite of its destruction by overzealous British military officers, it has lived on as a powerful historical episode marking early African nation building and anti-imperialism. The mere act of declaring their sovereignty vis-a-vis Europeans in Africa using a written constitution and the terminology of nationhood immortalized the Fante Confederation. It became a powerful reference point for anti-colonial activists throughout the British colonial period in Ghana. In a famous speech, you knew Kwame Nkrumah was coming, right? In a famous speech delivered by Kwame Nkrumah in 1953, the future president reminded the people of the Gold Coast that they had demanded self-government before. He insisted that it was their destiny to be self-governing and referred to the Fante Confederation as, quote, the earliest manifestation of Gold Coast nationalism. So this Fante Confederation didn't live very long, but in another way it really did, because it was always like this hallmark of what had happened in the past. So the question in my mind, many questions in my mind, but how did the Fante coalition of the 18th century, a political system designed to protect people from the slave trade and also to ensure the Fante's lucrative middleman role in that trade, evolve into the African nationalist movement of the 1860s? If I want to tell the story of Fante history following the ending of the slave trade, I have to connect these two political institutions. They are both, after all, instances of Fante state formation. But the existing historiography of coastal Ghana in the 19th century treats the Fante as victims of a long, slow march toward British colonization. It emphasizes, the existing literature, that is, emphasizes how the Fante allied with the British in war, how many of them converted to Christianity and embraced the English language and other aspects of British culture. And it is almost obsessively, the literature is almost obsessively focused on the wars between the British and Asante. This is most of the literature being mostly written by British historians, right? So here's just one of many paintings, illustrations of one of the many so-called Anglo-Asante wars. Some authors claim there were 6 Anglo-Asante wars. In other writings, there were 3 Anglo-Asante wars. It depends on how many of the battles you count as wars. But of course, the British were obsessed with this, just like they were obsessed with like the Zulu wars, right? Because they lost sometimes to the Africans. So there's this whole obsession, really, with these wars, and the story of what was going on with the Fante has really been sort of downplayed as the background to that, because the Fante were usually on the side of the British, because they didn't want to be conquered by Asante. But my point is, just because they were fighting against their common enemy doesn't mean the British controlled them for this whole time period, right? There's got to be more to the story than just the Fante fell in line with the British and then the British colonized at the end, which is sort of how the existing literature is written. So, what would a Fante-focused history look like? Is there evidence of continued state formation or the existence of a Fante coalition or confederacy between the beginning of the 19th century and 1870? Or did the Fante in fact become pawns of the British? Was the Fante Confederation of 1868 just a momentary act of desperation in response to recent events involving the British? In fact, as you might have guessed, I'm going to argue that the Fante elite were very much engaged in maintaining a Fante state throughout this period, in spite of being conquered by Asante in, oh, I didn't get to the, let me go back to this. So in 1807, really in 1816, Asante military forces came in and destroyed most of the towns on the Gold Coast. And they were colonial occupiers, the Asante were colonial occupiers of the coast until about 1831, when, of course, the British claim they forced the Asantes out. Really, the Fantes forced the Asantes out. But either way, they're conquered and occupied by Asante for part of the beginning of the 19th century. Then they get independence or regain their sovereignty in 1831, and then a whole bunch of important things are happening up to 1868. So what if we think about this time period, 1800 to 1874, more or less, from the perspective of someone like James Bannerman? From his perspective, the early and mid-1800s were not about British colonization or the Anglo-Asante Wars, but about building a Fante government. Bannerman grew up in Cape Coast, the son of a Fante mother and a Scottish father. Scottish father who was living in Ghana at the time. He first attended a school run by the British Company at Cape Coast, which was mainly a school for the children of European men and African women. Then he spent several years schooling in England. Back in Ghana, he worked for the company as a treasurer, interpreter, map reader, military officer, and eventually administrator. He was acting governor of Cape Coast, and therefore acting governor of all of the British forts on the Gold Coast in 1851. And that really only happened because the white man who had been the governor died, and they couldn't get his replacement to the Gold Coast for a year. But it is nevertheless pretty symbolic that an African man was put in charge of all of the British forts. And it would never happen again. So in spite of being on the payroll of the British Company, though, Bannerman was also recognized as a free trader. He had sufficient influence locally to muster a couple hundred men who could assist the British or the Fante in war. In 1822, he was part of a politically active group of Fante elites who made recommendations to the British government, as in sending letters to England, including a recommendation that they should overthrow the Asante Kingdom in order to advance, quote, civilization and Christian knowledge. And obviously, overthrowing the Asante Kingdom would also be in their best interest as traders. Bannerman and others of a similar status in urban coastal society provide a different perspective on this time period. For example, he explained in an interview by a select committee of Parliament that the coastal Fante would never try to destroy the British trading forts because they were useful in times of war as a place where women and children took refuge. The British were always trying to figure out, are the Fantes our allies? Or are they our enemies? Are they our allies or are they our enemies? To the Fante, it was like, you're here, you have a big building, it's useful, when we're being attacked. So we're not your allies or your enemies, but if we can use this thing, then we're going to do it. But you only get that perspective from individuals like Bannerman, who were able to write about that stuff or express their views in these more intellectual contexts. He describes many of the many chiefdoms among the Fante as semi-autonomous and sometimes in direct conflict with each other. But he also explained that they would cooperate instantly if threatened by Asante. The nature of Fante government, in other words, was not a kingdom. It was rather a flexible coalition, which was actually quite typical in pre-colonial Africa, but something that the British could never understand. If they couldn't recognize a king who was in charge, then they felt that there was no government, it was an inferior African society, and therefore not worthy of much attention, right? Asante, they respected because they had a king. Fante, they always thought, these people don't have a government, because they couldn't understand it. But again, if you listen to 19th century Fante intellectuals' explanations of these things, it's perfectly clear. So using sources like Bannerman's testimony and political activism, and thinking about this time period in terms of continuation from the era of the slave trade, rather than as something entirely different, it's clear that many of the historical forces that shaped Fante politics, culture, and identity in the 18th century remained in effect in the 19th century. One of those things was the region's profound interconnectedness with the Atlantic world. Do we still say Atlantic world? That's kind of like passé now, but that thing that we used to call the Atlantic world, that we now know is actually bigger than the Atlantic world. This, I think, is what's missing from the existing literature. Already at the dawn of the 19th century, the elite families of the Gold Coast lived a cosmopolitan lifestyle characterized by international travel and education. Their involvement in the palm oil trade, and sometimes the illegal slave trade, meant they had extensive interactions with foreign people and ideas, particularly those circulating through Britain, Sierra Leone, and southwestern Nigeria. Fante merchant families were part of an English-speaking, mission-educated, Christian African elite for whom the prospect of developing self-governing modern African nations was an imminent possibility in the 1860s. And English-speaking, Christian, literate African elites who were thinking these kinds of ideas about building African nations, of course, existed in a lot of different places in the early 19th century. They were in Britain. Frederick Douglass was in Britain at this time. Fante traders were in Britain. I'm trying to find Frederick Douglass in the same room with Fante traders because I think it probably happened. They were definitely in the Caribbean. They were definitely in the United States. Sierra Leone was like the major crossroads of all of these people. So Fante state formation, the Fante Confederacy, doesn't just represent the Fantes reacting to British Asante wars. It's a much bigger intellectual sphere of interaction and African identity formation that has been completely left out of the story of the Fante in the 19th century. The most important link was nearby British Sierra Leone, an utterly transatlantic place in the 19th century. Despite the presence of a British colonial government, by the mid-1800s, Sierra Leone was mainly inhabited and largely governed by English-speaking Protestant descendants of enslaved Africans. The settler population of Sierra Leone brought with them the anti-slavery, anti-racist rhetoric and political activism of the Americas, where leaders of slave rebellions and political activists like Frederick Douglass had begun to launch a major challenge to racial inequality. From the beginning of the 19th century and increasingly after 1830, the elite families of the Gold Coast sent their sons to Sierra Leone for education. Imagine young men from the Gold Coast living and studying alongside the children of freed slaves from America. Another occasion for interaction between Sierra Leone's settler population and Gold Coast people took place in the trading forts, the former slave forts, on the Gold Coast. Because for a period in the 1820s and again in the 1840s, the British forts on the Gold Coast were administered by the governor of Sierra Leone, which meant that African personnel from Sierra Leone were often stationed on the Gold Coast. And the most famous of these was a man named Africanus Horton. He changed his first name to Africanus because he wanted to embrace his African identity. He was educated as a physician in England and spent part of his career on the Gold Coast, where he authored a book entitled West African Countries and Peoples, subtitle A Vindication of the African Race. That was right before the Fante Confederation was formed. Another significant diaspora influence on Gold Coast political ideology, again stemming from the transatlantic scope of Britain's First Empire, were the West India regiments, which were brought to the Gold Coast as early as the 1840s. This, I just have to admit, this is a random picture that's labeled West India regiments that I found on the internet, but I think it may have something to do with what some of those people look like. So the West India regiments were composed of slaves or freedmen from the British Caribbean. They were brought to the Gold Coast as early as the 1840s and fought alongside Fante troops in the Anglo-Ashanti Wars. So imagine, again, the conversations between Fante soldiers and those recently arrived from Jamaica or Barbados as they were fighting against Ashanti in the Gold Coast interior. What would they have been talking about? The book also reconsiders the relationship between the Fante and the British, challenging the notion that British power was constantly progressing toward domination. And I will maybe summarize a little bit of this, but one of the things that I want to examine in the book is when and how did British anti-black racist attitudes really start to affect their relationship with the Fante? We have James Bannerman being put in charge of the entire British Gold Coast forts and settlements in 1851. But by the 1860s, the British personnel on the Gold Coast are much more explicitly racist. They are much more explicitly forbidding any African-born person or person of African ancestry from holding any but the most menial jobs within the administration of the forts. So in other words, there's a sort of particular moment around the 1850s when British racism really starts to become a factor, which of course is part of the evolution of African identity and anti-racist ideas among Fante elites. And I give an example also of one of the crazy British ideas that some of the military officers had in the 1850s was to create this thing called the poll tax. The poll tax ordinance of 1852. They're supposed to cooperate with the chiefs, the African rulers on the coast, and collect a tax and use it to build schools, pave roads, generally do things that are going to be for the benefit of the population, which is 99.99% African. Not surprisingly, the British officers who were running this program sort of embezzled the money and weren't doing any of the things they were supposed to and weren't consulting the chiefs. And the chiefs shut it down. They staged armed protests, stopped cooperating, and that was it. Which is very different from just 20 years later when the British are taking control by force and the Fante have lost power. So there's something happening there in terms of Fante rulers and elites being ready and willing to declare that they are in charge and they are not doing what the British want them to do if it's not in their best interest. If it is in their best interest, okay. If it's not in their best interest, no. And that really doesn't switch, I argue, until the 1870s. Okay, so to conclude, because I want to talk about this with you all, there's more to Fante history in the 19th century than British imposition and Asante wars. Fante elites were developing ideas and plans for a sovereign Fante nation, and they were influenced very much in doing so by the diaspora. They developed their own brand of what we might call PanAfricanism. That term has a lot of meanings, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But they developed it in conversation with Black intellectuals and activists from other parts of the world. The Fante Confederacy of 1868 was not a knee-jerk reaction to a British officer's decision not to assist the Fante in war. It was a natural culmination of an organic process of state building that had been part of Fante history since at least the 18th century. And Robin Law is working on a book arguing that it goes back to the 17th century. And it was an articulation of sentiments circulating among African and African-descended people that was fundamentally anti-racist in nature. All right, so I will stop there and welcome questions and comments.
Thank you. So the floor is open. We've got 20 minutes for questions and comments and conversation. Can one of you hit the lights maybe? Yeah. Thanks.
I could go on about the poll tax ordinance if you want me to. Yes.
Professor Shumway, for that great talk, and it leaves a lot of questions open for me about history, as I'm mostly specializing in 21st century, late 20th century Ghanaian history. But one of the things I've been thinking about is what is really the extent to which the British, right, as an imperial colonizing force, actually control the Gold Coast region, right? If we're really talking about a few forts, I mean, there's a question I have about population density, right? But you know, I think in the public imagination, in the light historical imagination, is that, you know, what is Ghana today was uncontestedly, uniformly dominated by the British from the mid-19th century, you know, till 1957, right? So I have questions about Dutch sovereignty in the area, right? Coalitions around between the Fante and the Dutch in particular, or Ashanti in the Dutch. But given your talk, I'm wondering, maybe you can clarify, really, how can we think about the British as colonizer or as a polity, but they're vastly outnumbered, right? You know, and what are the real you know, areas of domination given Ashanti Kingdom and this sense of really autonomy by the Fante in this particular era? So particularly in the around this question of prior to 1874.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. And there are a lot of books that say the British were in charge. From people attach themselves to different dates. So 1844, there was this document called the Bond of 1844. Some people interpret that as the beginning of British authority. Anyway, one of the problems is, and I've just been trying to write about this, is the sources themselves. So if you look at the British sources, even in the 18th century sometimes, these guys, you know, narrative of a visit to the Gold Coast in blah, 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 describing the African customs and whatever, they will claim that the British are rulers of the people. They will claim that you know, the territories adjacent to the forts are under their control and under their authority. I mean, they called the guys in the castles, the lead man in Cape Coast Castle or Anamabo Castle was called the governor, which implies jurisdiction, right? They didn't have any jurisdiction. So if you look at the British sources, you will have the definite sense that they were in charge. Like they had authority. They were thinking of it as a colony that they ruled. But how do we test that? There are also documents, you know, one of the sources that I'm using a lot for this project is the select committees of Parliament. So after Britain abolishes the slave trade from Africa, they then start like interviewing their own guys to find out, is the slave trade still going on? Is the slave trade not going on? How can we stop it? But also, can we build cotton plantations? What would we have to do to get coffee plantations? Are the natives friendly? Like they're doing research on the Gold Coast and other parts of West Africa, both to figure out how to stop the slave trade, but also to figure out how can we now make money in other ways. And they ask all kinds of questions. And one of the questions they ask is, do we have authority outside the forts? And the guys who have been living there are like, no. We have authority over the fort, and if we don't pay a whole bunch of local African elites, we don't have water to drink. We don't have firewood. We don't have women to come in and take care of the vast majority of guys who are dying from malaria or yellow fever, which they didn't even know what that was. So they were totally, totally dependent. You know, and you mentioned the middle of the 19th century. That, of course, is the crucial time because that's when they start to get anti-malarial drugs that kind of work and enough scientific understanding of other, like, mosquito-borne diseases, and steamships and guns that kill a lot of people in a short amount of time that they can bring in. So those things really shift the balance, but those things are not there in the 1850s. They start to come in the 1860s. And by the Ashanti War of 1860, I don't even know when it technically started, I guess 72 or 73. By then, the British government in Britain was almost convinced that it would be a good idea to actually claim colonial rule and like hold themselves to all of the expenses that came with that, right? But prior to that, there was no official policy. There was a great unwillingness to spend any money, which you can't set up a colony without being willing to send people there. And sending people there was a bad idea because they all died or laid around half dead from malaria and the rest drunk. So it wasn't even a viable prospect for them to claim to be in charge before the late 1860s. But they said they were, and some of them thought they were. I mean, the guy, Sir Charles McCarthy, who came to push the Asante out in the 1820s, he came from Sierra Leone. He was like, they're not going to take our forts. We're the British. And he was beheaded. His skull is still in Kumasi. They're like, yeah, right. You know, you and what army, literally, because they all got lost in the forest and sick and died. And they didn't have the ability to actually have any authority, but they wrote that they did. So if you use those sources to tell the story of the Gold Coast in the 19th century, the British thought, a lot of the British writers thought, and then it's been repeated in the colonial period histories, that, oh yeah, this was our protectorate. We were protecting them, but they weren't. So you kind of have to be willing to say, the documents say this, but it ain't true. Like, no. Yes.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm just curious, so it seems like in the historiography, sort of dominant narratives or explanations for why the Fante Confederation failed usually involve British shutting it down, arresting the intellectuals who are drafting this constitution. But I'm just curious how non-elite Fante were understanding this constitution. Did it have favor from the larger community? Did they know this was even going on? What sort of sources might you have to move beyond just the elites and intellectuals who are drafting?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to try to I think that would be really great to know. I think the average Fante fisherman or farmer or artisan probably wasn't very much aware of these political maneuverings. They were aware of the wars because everybody had to show up with a gun when the call went out for a war. So my guess would be that they didn't know very much about it. It wasn't really in their interest necessarily. Like if it had been up to them, they probably would have had another idea. Like, why do we need to invest in this idea of civilization? I mean, the elites were all in with the 3 C's. Commerce, Christianity, and civilization. They had fully incorporated those British values. I mean, some of these guys, I think Bannerman may be one of them, the way they write about the Asantes is horrifying. They call them barbarians, they're uneducated, they're, that's not the kind of Africans they wanted to be. So these guys are not representative at all of like normal mass Fante interests. I think most Fante people in this time period would have been much more involved with and affected by the local, town or village level goings on, and of course, because of the nature of the sources, we can't really know very much for sure. The other question that somebody should be asking me is, what about women? Because this is one of those studies and stories where women appear to be absent in a sense, because it's men and chiefs and merchants. But of course, women are essentially involved in all of these things. They're just not mentioned by name in very many of the documents. But, you know, Bannerman was married to the daughter of the Asantehene. Am I getting that right? Was it him? So, you know, women were the glue among the elites. They were probably the people who were really keeping the trade going, because the men were traveling or doing whatever men do. They were probably the ones on the spot, like actually doing the trading and keeping track of the values of things. So women and common, for lack of a better word, commoners are not very present in this story, unfortunately. But yeah, I should think more about how to put them in. There's also another thing. I'm not even letting you guys. If there's questions, throw your hand up, because I'll just keep talking. Yes.
I guess thank you, of course, for the great talk. I guess I was just kind of curious in this kind of not Atlantic, but kind of larger global kind of intellectual exchange that these Fante elites become a part of. I guess I'm wondering. So you mentioned abolitionism is one of these kind of currents that's going through, and I guess that's obviously like a big broad movement. I guess I wonder, kind of related to that, if there's evidence of what the Fante think about the colonization movement. And, you mentioned Frederick Douglass. I guess I think of people like Martin Delaney in this sense. I mean, Lagos is on the map as part of this network. He's probably a little late for this, but I guess I'm just kind of curious if there's kind of more complicated sets of ideas that are being exposed to that don't have quite the same, maybe necessarily like anti-racist trajectory.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the main point of departure between the Fante elites and their intellectual counterparts in the diaspora is the Fante elites owned a lot of slaves. That was, especially in the decades immediately following 1807, the one thing that an African trader could invest wealth in that could not be taken away by a European creditor was slaves, right? If you own 200 slaves and you owe a debt to the governor of Cape Coast Castle, it's illegal for him to come and take that property from you because it's against the law, because he's British. But if you have a chest full of gold or ivory or barrels of rum or tobacco or any other commodity, your creditor can come and seize that. So that's also, slaves were very much incorporated into the institution of chieftaincy. You can't be a chief in the Gold Coast without having hundreds of slaves who, the slave who carries your sandals, the slave who carries the stool, the slave who plays the trumpet, the slave who plays, and women, female slaves. So they were not on board with anti-slavery, which makes it really hard to, in some ways, make the argument that they are part of this diaspora-driven movement. But I think that's actually exactly how it was. They were on board with all of it. They just wanted to be able to continue to own slaves. And for them, there was no contradiction in that. Trading slaves to white men was very immoral. You must not do that. They're writing in the very first West African newspapers, the horrible slave trade is still going on over in Calabar, blah, blah, blah. That can never happen. But my slaves at my house are my property, and those are my wives, and those are my, people who work for me and earn money for me. So that part of it is also very complicated and doesn't, well, I was going to say doesn't mesh well with the whole Christianity part, but then again,
Where does it end?
many of the slave owners were Christians, so.
Probably have time for one more question, at least officially, until we break up at one. Carly?
I'll be here for afterwards, so I can ask now, but if somebody who's
It's fine, go ahead.
yeah, just to build off of what you were saying, one thing I'm noticing in this very political conversation that's happening in academia about slavery in Africa versus slavery in America is like this debate of rooted in like the morals of our time, but also why is nobody like distinguishing more that chattel slavery and the slavery that's been around throughout the world are different things? And so I wonder if what you're saying about you can't sell an enslaved person to a white man comes from, was there any discourse about like the sheer brutality of white men, and that would maybe be like the moral demarcation?
I mean, there were Africans who were opposed to slavery. I shouldn't give the impression that nobody in Ghana in the 19th century who was African was opposed to slavery. There were some people who were.
But were they opposed like more to British slavery? Because perhaps, I'm just wondering in this diaspora discussion that you're talking about, is there a reference to the extensive levels of dehumanization that, and that's why maybe?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they were privy to the abolitionist literature, a lot of Equiano's story and other people's stories. They knew that slavery in the Americas was something different, and they condemned it, and they tried to dissociate themselves from it.
I was just going to make a very quick point. I'm teaching a class on drama, African and Caribbean drama, and one of the plays we read was Amata Zanoa, which I think places the question of domestic slavery, which is a sort of, a slave that's supposedly integrated into the family. But the title character in that play is a very tragic figure because she does not accept that rationale at all. Slavery for her is slavery. Enslaving people is condemnable. The bond of 1844 is there. The play is set more or less in 1872, so just on the eve of de facto colonization. And I think it condemns also the sort of complicity of the elite in British colonization, sort of opening themselves up. But the question of slavery and that sort of ghost, that unspoken ghost in contemporary Ghanaian politics and liberation discourse, et cetera, is I think a very key aspect in the play. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's sort of, it's 1972 is from the last century, but I think it's an interesting commentary on the discussion that you were having.
Definitely, yeah. And the thing is, from the point of view of the enslaved person, obviously, there should be no slavery.
Right.
It's wrong, it's horrible.
Right.
But if you ask the slave owner about slavery, there's always going to be some kind of complicated justification for the kind of slavery that they're involved with. So, I agree. It's a total mess, and I've had Ghanaian audience members, hear me talk and stand up or raise their hands afterwards and say, no, we didn't ever have slavery in Ghana. Those were, they were part of the family.
Right.
They were integrated. They were. What about those slave markets in Salaga that still existed after there was no slave trading on the coast? Like, that seems like, But then you also have to come back again and say, but it's not the same thing as this craziness that was happening in the Western world.
Yeah.
So that's a big can of worms going on.
So, just past 1 o'clock, we're going to break off, but I'm sure Rebecca will be willing to hang around and answer a few questions
Absolutely.
people didn't get to answer.
Thank you.